going? It's Khoa here, and in this podcast, I would like to introduce you to a man named Donald Robertson. He is the author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. This is a podcast interview I've been waiting to do for quite some time. I'm a strong believer in Stoicism, and Stoicism, it's an ancient philosophy, and it's all about how you cope with problems, find wisdom and fortitude by going inward from how you perceive things and how you react to things. And also check out Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius, he is a Roman emperor. He was the last good Roman emperors. What was really fascinating about Marcus Aurelius was that he had everything. He had, he had access to everything. He had the fortune. He had access to the entertainment, the women as well. Had all of it. But he didn't indulge in all of that stuff. What he did was he dealt with problems. He sat down and he tried to sort out all of these problems by writing his thoughts down. His book, Meditations, that was a book that was incredibly insightful into how he thinks and how he copes with all these problems. Some of the things that you'll learn in Stoicism can really help shape your life, and it's really helped my life as well. I was going through some really tough times in my life. Just by reading through Marcus Aurelius's content and his quotes and his ideas, it's really helped me cope with all the problems that I'm having, and that's what really led me into studying Stoicism. So Donald Robertson, he is currently based in Athens, Greece, and he's got over 20 years of studying Stoicism, ancient philosophy. He's a historian. He's also connected to the Freemasons as well. So I think his parents were also Freemasons. So he was calling in from Athens, Greece. So it's really exciting to interview someone from that distance. So there's a lot to cover in this particular interview, but yeah, it's a very in-depth interview. I highly recommend for you to check out Stoicism if you don't know much about it. Let's go have a look at Donald Robertson, check out Stoicism, and to learn about ancient philosophy. So let's have a look. Thanks.
Hi.
Hello.
Let me just switch my video on.
How you going?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah. What's the weather like in Greece?
Actually, it was raining yesterday, but apart from that, it's been pretty warm here, as you might expect.
Yeah.
Like 26 degrees or something the other day.
Yeah, looking good. Looking very relaxed and enjoying yourself there. Nice. Are you in your office or you're just somewhere else?
I'll be where I'm staying at the moment because I'm traveling and stuff.
Yep.
I'm going to Belgium in a few days' time.
Yep. Oh wow, that's incredible.
And then I'm going back to Toronto. I kind of live in Toronto.
Yeah.
Sort of live in Toronto, but I travel a bit at the moment. So I was in the Netherlands, and then I was in Athens. Went to Sparta the other day. That was interesting.
Wow.
And then was there for a couple of days in the mountains, Sparta, for this big sporting event called Spartan Race.
Okay. What was that like?
Yeah, it's crazy. Like there's a lot of kind of athletes, like a lot of kind of extreme. It's an obstacle course race. So
did you participate, or did you participate?
No,
or
I'm not that athletic. I do a bit of exercise, but not enough to keep up with those guys. I can't do that. I can't run up and down mountains.
We got to keep trying, right?
Don't give up. I wouldn't mind having a go. I'm kind of tempted, but I'd probably need to train quite a bit to get in shape to do it.
Yeah. Oh wow. So you're doing a bit of traveling, right? Or you just travel full time and just you write.
I'm doing traveling at the moment because I have to promote my latest book and also running conferences. So I was staying in Toronto, and then I went to New York.
Yep.
And then I was in the Netherlands, in Athens and Sparta, and in Belgium, and then back to Toronto. And then I'm going to Quantico in Virginia to speak to the Marine Corps University. And then I'm going to Brazil because 3 of my books have just been translated there.
Yep.
So yeah, kind of getting around a little bit for.
That's great.
Stoicism conferences and talks and stuff that I'm doing basically.
Yeah, well, yeah. Thanks a lot for your time. I really appreciate your time. And I saw what you're doing. You had the latest book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and it's all about Stoicism. Yeah, that's the one. And I love the book cover, and as soon as I typed in Stoicism, your name came up, and I thought, I got to get this guy. I got to get this guy on the podcast. Fantastic. Okay, so let's get started with your background. Like, how did you? What made you get started with the whole Stoicism? Like, what was that thing that made you get into the Stoicism? How did you get started into it?
Well, if you want the long version of the story, like my father passed away when I was pretty young. I was only about 13 years old, and he had lung cancer, and so he passed away. And he didn't leave many things behind. My family were pretty poor. We didn't have many possessions back in the day, so we didn't have a car, for example, or a
No
fridge.
car. Wow.
Like basic stuff. So he left behind a bunch of Freemasonic books because I have to explain this to people sometimes. In Freemasonry is part of the culture in parts of Scotland, and in my hometown, most of my fathers were Freemasons.
Wow.
My father was a Freemason, and he left behind these books, and so I thought I'd have a look at them. Yeah. Couldn't make head nor tail of them. There's a lot of Hebrew and stuff and weird symbolic things. So I started to I started learning Hebrew actually, and the local church minister helped me, and that kind of got me into reading the Bible. And then I read the Gnostic Gospels and the Apocrypha, and then that got me into reading about Neoplatonism, because here's a little obscure bit of trivia, but it's an interesting one.
Okay.
In the 1940s in Egypt, they found a buried cache of early Christian Gospels called the Nag Hammadi, or the Chenobskyan Library.
Wow.
It's a treasure trove of ancient texts. And they were bound. And in one of those books, they had early Christian Gnostic Gospels and stuff that was influenced by Neoplatonism. But this Christian community had bound alongside those Gospels an excerpt from Plato's Republic.
Okay.
How weird is that?
Wow.
So if the Bible, if history had developed differently, Plato could have been in the Bible. Like they had
that's amazing.
A Bible that had Plato in it, which is really strange. So that got me into reading Plato and learning about Socrates. And then I decided to go through the whole history of Western philosophy in chronological order. I got to the Middle Ages, and then I felt it got a bit boring. Like, so I kind of forward to the Scottish Enlightenment. And then I went to university eventually, and I did my degree in philosophy. And I was on this quest. I was practicing self-help techniques and doing meditation because I kind of wanted to help myself somehow. I was kind of struggling and looking for the right. I was looking at philosophy and all different world religions. I read the Upanishads and the Tao Te Ching and all this Christian stuff and mystical stuff, Thomas à Kempis and the Cloud of Unknowing and all this kind of stuff. So I read very widely in philosophy and religion when I was like 17, even younger. And I got into psychotherapy. I started reading Freud and Jung because I kind of wanted to do something to help other people as well. And I kind of wanted to have a career where I might be helping people.
Yep.
And 4 years later, after finishing my philosophy degree at Aberdeen University, I was still equally confused. And I was struggling to find a way to bring these things together. And then I was reading a book on Neoplatonism by a guy called Pierre Hadot, and I thought it was so good that I'd go and read all of his other books. And Hadot wrote a number of books about Stoicism. The main one was an analysis of Marcus Aurelius' meditations called The Inner Citadel. And it suddenly hit me like a diamond bullet straight between the eyes. I had this kind of epiphany. And I realized that you don't study Stoicism ordinarily in a philosophy degree. And actually, the interesting reason why you don't study it normally at university is that academic philosophers think the Stoics didn't really create any new theories. They took aspects of earlier philosophy and developed the practical applications of them. So academic philosophers don't find that interesting, but everybody else does. That's precisely what people think is interesting about the Stoics, that they developed aspects of Socrates' philosophy into a self-help or self-improvement system. And so the one stone that had been cast aside by the builders turned out to be the cornerstone, as the saying goes. And I realized that Stoicism had all these psychological techniques, kind of meditation techniques.
Yeah.
And I realized it provided a workable philosophy of life, and also discovered, because I was now training in psychotherapy, that modern cognitive behavioral therapy, which developed in the mid-1950s, was inspired by Stoic philosophy and drew its philosophical inspiration from it. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about the significance of that later. But the key thing was I had these three interests, and I was like juggling these balls, and then suddenly they all came together and locked tightly into one thing. And apart from anything else, I thought, I don't need to read as many books anymore. I can just read the Stoics. So I was reading psychotherapy and psychology and philosophy and religion and stuff. And I thought, I could just focus on this one subject. And that was like, I don't know, 25 years or something. I don't want to count, but it was a long time ago. And it hasn't changed. To this day, I still feel a kind of existential relaxation because I found this niche and everything, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, just locked into place neatly for me. And I still feel that makes sense. So for a long time, until I was 19 or something, I guess it would have been, I was struggling to kind of make sense. And then one day it all just kind of clicked into place beautifully. And when I realized that that's what Stoicism was. Stoicism was the thing that I was looking for, that combined philosophy, meditation, and kind of psychotherapy all in one neat package.
That's amazing. I think I remember you saying that you've met a lot of people who might have dabbled in Stoicism, people who've started and people who've learnt it for quite some time, but you've never met someone who's actually left Stoicism. There's always someone that they're always in it. That, once you get into Stoicism, you just never really leave, right? You just keep on learning more and more, isn't it?
It's Stoicism's for life, not just for Christmas, I like
Yeah.
to say.
Yeah.
People get into it and they kind of stay into it. Another thing I like to say is I've never met anyone with an Albert Ellis, the founder of cognitive therapy. I've never met anyone with an Albert Ellis tattoo. So far, I'm still waiting and putting it out there. I get in touch if anyone's got one. But I keep meeting people with Marcus Aurelius tattoos and quotes from Stoicism and symbols. And the reason I think that's kind of interesting, it symbolizes something which is that people identify with Stoicism at a deeper level. Like it's almost like a substitute for a religion to them. And so it becomes a lifelong thing, whereas they learn CBT techniques or other self-help techniques, and then 6 months later they've forgotten them and kind of reverted back to their old habits. But the reason that Stoicism actually holds out so much promise is that people identify with it at an existential level. It becomes part of who they are, and they continue to read the Stoics and think about Stoicism, decades later, throughout the whole of their life. It doesn't go away.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've heard that presidents and great leaders, around the world, they've got the copy of Meditations by the bed, and they tend to read it because it's just a source of comfort, really, and it helps people just get over pain. I mean, that's what really drew me into Marcus Aurelius. Is just some of his quotes. It just helps me just deal with the frustrations. And for example, like he said. For example, like if I'm dealing with some angry people, some people who really frustrate me, like Marcus Aurelius talks about that, you've just met someone who is just part of the 1% or 10% of the population who's just always angry. You just got to accept that. Don't look at it as don't be so surprised that this person is an angry person. You just met a percentage of the population who's angry. So it really just changed your thinking. I just absolutely love it.
It's one of the themes. I mean, you've kind of touched on two things there. One is that the Stoics are eminently quotable. And there are several reasons for that. One is that they, in some limited respects, they were inspired by the Spartans. And I was just at Sparta the other day talking about this. So Sparta, the city of Sparta, is in an area that used to be called Laconia. And that's where we get the adjective laconic, to be laconic from. And to be laconic means to speak concisely. Right? And that's still an art I have to learn. But the Stoics and the Spartans were men of few words, and the Stoics prided themselves on trying to condense their philosophy into short, pithy, aphoristic sayings. And the reason they did that was they thought they should be easy to remember. They thought, what's the point in having a long, complicated speech if you think, that's really inspiring, and then you can't really remember it a couple of days later. And the ancient Athenians were known for that, like the sophists in particular, would have these very inspiring speeches, but you couldn't really, it was hard, we say now, what's the takeaway from this? But there wasn't always a clear takeaway. Whereas the Stoics thought, you have to be able to sum this up in a couple of words, so that you could kind of engrave it in your mind and you remember it in the face of a stressful situation. Because otherwise, it's like sand running through your fingers. All of this wisdom is difficult to kind of properly assimilate it. And the other reason it's like that is we only have about 1% of the original Stoic texts surviving today. Like, a lot of ancient libraries were destroyed, and ancient texts were very fragile things. There weren't as many copies of them either. And the Christian Church, in part, was responsible for suppressing some of these texts by earlier pagan authors. So the ones that we have surviving are the cream of the cream, the 1% that people thought were most remarkable. So in a way, we kind of have Stoicism that's been curated for us by 2,000 years of history, and people have went, if you wanted to save 1% of this stuff, like Marcus Aurelius would have to be in that 1%, Seneca and Epictetus would have to be in that 1%. So I kind of reassure myself, and I comfort myself with the thought that the other 99% of the Stoic writings were maybe kind of boring. They possibly weren't good. I'm sure there were good bits in it, but we've probably got the best bits, actually. And that's one of the reasons, because these texts are very beautiful and profound and memorable. That is one of the main things that actually helps people to get more benefit from them, because they spend longer thinking about it and digesting it, and they remember it years later.
Definitely. Like you've mentioned Seneca as well. I've read the book on the shortness of life. Fantastic book. What are your thoughts on, because there was a bit of controversy surrounding this book, where the time it was written was the time when Jesus was also born as well, but there was no reference to Jesus at the beginning of the book or something, like during the book. Did you pick up that one as well? Like, I think there was a bit of controversy surrounding there. What are your thoughts on that?
Roughly a generation after.
Was it?
Time I remember he was a contemporary. He was contemporary with St. Paul. And there were, for many centuries, a series of letters, fake letters. In the ancient world, it was fairly common to fake books, particularly letters, actually, were often fake. I guess maybe people made money by selling fake letters or something. I don't know, but there's a lot of these things. And there were a bunch of fake letters between St. Paul and Seneca. But what everyone always mentions when they bring this up is, well, if nothing else, it proves that early Christians really wanted St. Paul and Seneca to be friends, and they kind of thought that they looked like they should be. And some people have said St. Paul looks like he's influenced by Stoicism. There's actually a passage in the Acts of the Apostles where the Stoics are mentioned, which not a lot of people know that. The Stoics and the Epicureans are at the foot of the Acropolis in Athens. You can probably see it out my window, like not a stone's throw from here.
Yeah.
And on the Areopagus, this rock, tourist attraction today, St. Paul spoke to a crowd of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, and he quotes some lines of poetry to them. And one of them is a couple of lines from a poet called Aratus, who was a student of Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. So if he quotes from a Stoic piece of poetry to this audience of Epicureans, but he kind of argues with them. The Seneca, I mean, not many pagan authors really mention the Jesus, and certainly not until generations later. That's a problem for Christian scholars, is this kind of the lack of references to Jesus Christ and reliable historical sources. And also, when the early Romans, when the Romans of the imperial era talk about Christians, the way that they perceive them is as a kind of like a suicide cult or something. Like they don't have a very flattering image of Christians. They even Marcus Aurelius says in passing, he'd learned as a young man not to pay attention to charlatans and sorcerers and people who perform exorcisms, which by implication would only have been Christians. So his perception is he lumps them in with kind of hoodoo merchants and hucksters, and he thinks that they're mainly of them as people who go around promising to do bogus exorcisms on people. So the Stoics didn't really, maybe know that much about the Christians, and certainly didn't hold them in high regard.
Okay. So what about what's your thoughts on the reason why Seneca committed suicide at the end? What were your what's your thoughts on that? Because I think that idea was divided. Some people said that it was, he was persuaded to kill himself, but some people who say that he did it out of his own will. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, he was forced to, I mean, in the ancient world, it was common to execute people by forced suicide, as it's phrased.
Yeah, forced suicide, okay.
Forced suicide. So you're gonna kill yourself, but you don't have any choice about it. Like if you don't do it, we'll do it for you, kind of was the proposition. And that's how Socrates died, in a different mode, but he was, by the Athenian court, he was told to drink hemlock. So he was told to kill himself. And so Seneca was told to kill himself by Nero's guards. But he reputedly said, I mean, we have this account by Tacitus who says, that Seneca died like a Stoic sage, and he told his friends that he was mentally prepared for it. And like you were saying earlier, actually, the Stoics say that the wise man should never be surprised by anything. Not really. I mean, they actually have phrased this in a more nuanced and way. They'll say, obviously, someone runs up behind you and goes, boo, you would be shocked like anyone else. But the Stoic wise man isn't surprised by things in the sense that if someone steals his wallet, he doesn't go, oh my God, how could this possibly have happened?
Yeah.
Stuff happens, right? Wallets get stolen. Like I've seen it happen to plenty of other people. Like, it's one of those things that happens like to a lot of people eventually in life. Or if a relationship breaks up, he doesn't say, how could this possibly, I can't believe it, why me? He thinks it happens to other people, maybe happened to me before in the past. So he doesn't act surprised. The Stoics think it's kind of bogus in a way that people say, I can't believe it. Like it's not rational, it's not philosophical, because they should have known that these are the sort of things that happen in life. And that's how Seneca responds to his execution. He says, yeah, Nero executes people. It's what he does. It's how he do. He says Nero's a sociopath and a tyrant, and he
did it. Oh, wow.
I kind of thought it might happen eventually, and I guess the time's come, and that was how he reacted to it. But he also is very consistent with what he writes, because he talks about mentally rehearsing your own death and on a daily basis, kind of visualizing the things that might possibly go wrong as if they're happening now. And one of those must have been that each day he imagined the knock on his door and the guards saying, your time's up, buddy. Like, so that, when it eventually happened, he was like, yeah, I've pictured this hundreds of times.
Yeah. It reminds me of that quote that Marcus Aurelius said. He goes, oh, death smiles at us all, but all a man can do is smile back. So I love that quote that Marcus said. So
that's from the movie Gladiator.
Oh, is it? Oh, wow.
Yeah, he doesn't say that in the Meditations, but he says things that that's the one thing in Gladiator that's pretty close to the stuff that he says in the Meditations. It's not a quote, but it's kind of it's similar to things that he says. So I'll give them that one. It's close enough. It definitely sounds like something Marcus might have said.
Yeah.
He says close to it. So yeah, this is a big theme. Socrates said this as well. Socrates actually went so far as to say that the whole of philosophy is a milite thanatou. He says it. A meditation or a training for death.
Yeah.
He says that's what philosophy is. It's to prepare you for death, which sounds like a very kind of radical thing to say, but
yeah,
he was the first to say that, and then the Stoics agreed with him.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure you also, let's go into the future now. So you know how with Steve Jobs, he invented Apple, and he said this really amazing speech, and he uses death. He uses death to really motivate him to create all these amazing products and to make use of time. So would you consider, by looking throughout all of Stoicism, that death was the primary driver to push these amazing innovations out? What do you think?
I think it's one of the drivers. And again, actually, they seemingly took this from Spartan culture in part. The Spartans said, someone asked the Spartan king, how is it that your warriors are so courageous in battle? And he said, because we train them to care about life, but to be unafraid of death. And Stoicism is kind of all about paradoxes. So Socrates was known for these paradoxes as well. So the Stoics value life, but at the same time, they're not afraid of death. And that is, one of the main things. Seneca says to learn how to die is to unlearn how to be a slave. he's, he puts, that's one of the most powerful,
Wow.
like that's a kind of, whoa, like really? And then to add to that, the fact that he faces death, patiently and courageously seems to make it a very compelling story out of it. So the Stoics believed that this was the secret to standing up to tyrants in particular. That if you're afraid of dying, then they know that the problem you're going to have is that in the ancient world, they've always got something over you. They're always going to have something over you as long as you're afraid. And the only way around that is to be unafraid of dying. That was their very simple argument. Under Domitian, a Roman emperor who came after Nero, who persecuted philosophers, he said, you guys need to get out of here. I'm going to exile a lot of you, because you're troublemakers. And you can stay if you shave your beards off.
Okay.
Because the beard at that time was a symbol of a philosopher. And he said, you could even tell which school of philosophy someone followed by the style of beard that they had. Okay. And he said, if you shave your beards off and take off your philosopher's robes, then I'll let you stay. But you're not walking around here dressed like philosophers and stuff. And like many tyrants, he said, I'm going to strip you of all the emblems of your ideology and belief, or you're out of here. We're going to obliterate this thing because I see it as destabilizing politically. And Epictetus implies, he tells a story to his students. It's not entirely clear if he means that he actually did this, but it sounds like he's saying to his students that he said, if you want to cut my beard off, you're going to have to cut my head off first. Which sounds again like a really kind of confrontational thing to say.
Yeah.
And many people have said, wow, this guy's really attached to his beard. But it was what it symbolized to him. It would be like someone like Epictetus, it would be like shaking the hand of a tyrant. He said, I'm not doing that because you're basically asking me to give in to dictatorship symbolically by doing that. So not a chance. So the Stoics were renowned for opposing political tyranny, and they argue that they were able to do that in part because they reconciled themselves to their own death. Although in the ancient world, I have to say that's kind of easier because people drop dead like flies, and like Seneca, saw a lot of his friends and associates getting the chop, so it wouldn't have been as big. He didn't have that much choice in a way, but to mentally prepare himself for it. We live in a society that's strangely inoculated from death.
Yeah.
We put elderly people in hospices. We have our food processed for us in factories, in abattoirs. We don't see animals dying or people dying much, but in the ancient world, that was a daily occurrence. And the mortality rate was higher, so people were more reconciled to the concept of their own mortality because it was much more in your face. Whereas we're sheltered from it in a way that makes death appear more strange and more shocking and more alien to us than it has throughout the whole of at any point throughout the whole of human history.
Yeah, definitely. You actually wrote a book called Building Your Resilience as well, and the latest one obviously is How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. So what you just mentioned is that in modern times, at the moment, people don't have that resiliency. So would you say that reading through all the philosophy, the Stoicism, that builds that internal fortitude that people need, and then that will help shape their future, help them prepare for the future?
We don't have, I'm an evidence-based psychotherapist, so I'm committed to saying we test everything and gather proper, well-controlled research on it. But that said, we do have a lot of research that shows the research on resilience build, like in mental health, most of the research, 99% of the research that we do is on clinical populations, and it's remedial or therapeutic. Okay. So you have people that are already diagnosed as having a severe problem, and then we check out what actually works in terms of improving their symptoms. But prevention is better than cure, as everybody knows. And there's not as much. It's an emerging field of research now is on preventative mental health approaches. And that's harder to research because the longer the period of time that you have to do the research over, the less reliable the statistics are going to be because you're going to have attrition or dropout. And so if you want to do resilience training, you might have to measure people over 5, 10, 15 years And then it's going to be harder to construct studies like that and more expensive, and the data is going to be inherently less reliable. So it's harder to know for sure what works preventatively. But the best research we have suggests that a training that's based on CBT works. And what I can say is that CBT is inspired by Stoicism. So maybe we can have a little digression here, and I'll say one of the most important things.
That's cognitive behavioral therapy, right?
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
So Ellis, who is the founder of CBT, or the founder of the main precursor, rational emotive behavior therapy, depending on how you like to put it, Ellis was a psychoanalyst, and like a lot of great people, he woke up one day basically after a period of disillusionment and quit his job in a sense. Or he said, I'm going to start again from scratch because this psychoanalytic therapy just doesn't make sense to me. It's just not working out for me, this Freudian stuff. I'm going to have to scrap it and start again from scratch. And often that's the beginning of great things, when somebody says, trashes something and starts building again anew. And so he looked around, and as a teenager, decades earlier, he'd read Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, the Stoics. Hadn't read Seneca as much, apparently. But he decided to develop an approach to therapy that was inspired by them, and in particular by one of the fundamental psychological premises of Stoicism, perhaps the central psychological premise of Stoicism, which is passage 5 in the Enchiridion, or Handbook of Epictetus. And it says it's not things that upset us, or not events, pragmata, that upset us, but our opinions, dogmata, about them. So it's not events that upset us, but our opinions about them. And Ellis was so enamored of that quote that he taught it to all of his clients and all of his students. So it became a cliche in early cognitive behavioral therapy. And the reason that he was so attached to it is that it, in layman's terms, in plain language, it articulates what we now call the cognitive theory of emotion, which is the central theoretical premise of all cognitive therapy. So this is the foundation on which the whole of cognitive therapy stands. And so this kind of central point connects Stoicism and cognitive therapy. So all the research that supports CBT, in a sense, kind of in a slightly roundabout way, validates Stoicism, or validates one of the central premises of it. And then from that premise, the Ellis borrowed some techniques from Stoicism, but he and other cognitive therapists inevitably arrived at some similar conclusions, because when you start from the same place, you're often predestined to arrive at some of the same conclusions. And the reason that premise was so important, people often don't understand this, but it's a simple point. If someone has anger or anxiety or depression, they probably realize when they come to therapy, there's something wrong about it. It's not helping them. So they'll come into therapy saying, I feel really depressed and it doesn't make sense. I shouldn't feel this down, and it's kind of irrational, and I don't want to feel this way. But then as the therapist begins helping them to question it, at some point they'll usually say, look, I can't help it. It's just the way I feel. And that's a way of ending the conversation. It's like a chess move that allows you to say, I'm not going to change this. Like, listen, I can't help it. It's just the way I feel. If you think about it, that little chess move is a way of saying, I'm not going to change this. Like, can't help it. It's just the way I feel. It's just what it is, right, buddy? Like end of conversation. And that's kind of a sticking point in ordinary conversations about someone's irrational feelings. You go, okay, I guess it's just the way you feel. Like, well, then we're stuck with it, whatever. But if you adopt the cognitive theory of emotion, you would say, well, the way that you feel is dependent on underlying assumptions and beliefs that you have. That's what a cognition is: a belief, a thought, an assumption. And so Ellis would say to people who say that, but it's not just the way that you feel, it's also the way that you think. And the reason that's so important is because thoughts have truth value. So then you can say, what evidence is there for the thoughts that cause you to feel that way? So you feel depressed because of what beliefs? Because you believe everybody hates you. Let's say, nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I think I'll go and eat worms. There's a kind of nursery rhyme that kids learn. So everybody hates me, nobody likes me. But what evidence do you have that everybody hates you? Do you also believe things that contradict that? Is it even a consistent belief that you hold? What would be an alternate way of interpreting the things that you see that might be more rational, more plausible, and healthier. So you can begin evaluating the evidence. You can question whether there might be alternative ways of interpreting the same event, and it opens up a whole repertoire of cognitive therapy techniques. And the Stoics realized that. And but it took 2,000 years for modern psychotherapy to arrive at the same conclusion. And when it did, it was like a rocket taking off, and that's really the birth of modern evidence-based, research-based treatments and psychotherapy. Like, things got propelled forward a lot. Before that, Freud would have went, I don't know, let's talk about your dreams. Maybe sleep with your mum. Like, he was off in a very different direction with things.
It's always about the mother, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was all about the Oedipus complex and the mother.
Yeah.
It came from nowhere. Freud did zero research. Like, the reason that he believed all that stuff was because of his own dreams. So he had these issues himself, and he just assumed that other people had the same issues. He never did a single jot or a single stroke of research. And then when people actually did start doing research, they found like voluminous evidence to show there is a correlation between thinking that everybody hates you and feeling depressed, for example. And there are other typical beliefs that people have that seem to fuel depression and anxiety and so on. And when you change those beliefs, weirdly, the feelings change as well. And so many people have said there's an element of common sense to all this as well. In a sense that people have a kind of blind spot for this, but also from another perspective, it's like all the research is showing us stuff that we should have already realized. Like the Stoics figured it out without the tools of research 2,000 years ago. They were smart enough just through debate and reflection to figure out that it was their beliefs that were shaping their emotions. But the Stoics go a bit further, and they say, look, it's particularly certain types of beliefs. And I would have said this seems like a no-brainer as well, but the Stoics said it's your value judgments. Okay. Like, you think that if you believe that something is really important, that it's essential to living a good life, then you're going to freak out if somebody threatens it. So if you think that having a high status job is the most important thing in life, and you get made redundant, maybe you're going to freak out, you're going to feel depressed, you're going to be suicidal. Like, it's got to do with the belief that you hold. And maybe that belief is, to use the technical vocabulary that Albert Ellis introduced, he referred to it as crazy bullshit. Like, so maybe, yeah, like, Ellis was very blunt, like, with people. He'd say, this is crazy bullshit. Like, it's not the most important thing in life. Nobody really believes that on reflection, that having a particular job is the most important thing in life. You've hypnotized yourself into believing this crazy bullshit. Like, and then of course you're going to feel like your whole world has been shattered when you lose it. But another person might never have a job like that and be perfectly happy. Like, you're mistaken. Maybe this is inconsistent and irrational. Maybe there's a healthier way of looking at the whole situation. So we can start questioning things if we say it's about beliefs. Whereas, to go back to where we started, if someone says, it's just the way I feel, then we can do nothing. We have to say, no, it's also the way that you think. And what are those thoughts? What evidence is there for them? Now you've opened the door to therapy.
Yeah.
And if we do that preemptively, we can perhaps, it seems like we can build resilience. I should say I'm a founding member of a non-profit organization called Modern Stoicism, and part of our remit is to do research on Stoicism. And so it's in its very early days, so I don't want to oversell it, but we have a lot of not tightly controlled research on thousands of participants, and we're gradually working with psychologists towards developing more carefully controlled studies to get more robust data. But our early findings are indicative that Stoicism itself is therapeutic. And we recently did a 6-month follow-up. And actually, we found something quite surprising there. We found that when we trained people in Stoicism, using the same sort of measures that are used in psychological research studies in positive psychology and resilience building and so on, the same measures, so we can compare. Normally there'd be some drop off in the improvements that people get. Like, you'd expect that, as long as it's not a big drop off. So people that are trained in CBT or problem solving or stoicism or resilience building, you'd expect them to be less anxious and depressed at the end of it. And then 6 months later, you'd expect them to have kind of reverted back a bit, but hopefully not all the way back, right? Otherwise, you're going to have to keep retraining them every 6 months or whatever. But what we found with the Stoicism was that there was virtually no regression back to the mean. There was virtually no reduction in the loss of improvement. So, again, the lovely jargon that we like to use. Having said all these kind of like slightly convoluted things, it boils down to saying that Stoicism is sticky, is the way that psychologists like to say it. I like that. Stoicism is sticky. 6 months later, it's still sticky.
Yeah.
That's like the holy grail to them. Like, that's a big deal. Like the stickiness is everything. What's the point in learning something that helps you to improve your state of mind if it just wears off a couple months later? This is why people are self-help junkies. Half the clients you meet in therapy will say they have a whole library full of self-help books, and then you think, doesn't that suggest that none of them are working? Like,
that's a moment.
Self books. Like, I'm an expert. So now I need therapy. You can think, well, like, if you're in therapy, you still have a problem. You've read 100 self-help books.
Yeah.
Most have had that much benefit. Like, something obviously doesn't add up about this. So, the trick is to find something, and what you'll find is often people read these books, but then they don't really remember much of the advice. So they don't
you forget.
Yeah, you forget it, right? So you go, that was a really good book, but I don't remember much about it. So we want the battle, the struggle, the quest for the Holy Grail is to find something that 20, 30 years later, people go, I'm still doing that thing that Marcus Aurelius taught me to do. And, I find that with Stoicism, not everybody does the practices, but a lot of people do, and it becomes it's like doing press-ups or like some kind of exercise or whatever. It just becomes part of their daily routine. Marcus says that every morning he'd wake up, the first, in the meditations.
He will set expectations, right? He will set expectations on that he will meet crooks and crannies, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
liars and traitors and meddlers, but he says that in Meditations 2.1 is perhaps the most famous passage in the whole book. And actually, book 1 of Meditations is written in a very different style, and there's also a little rubric that suggests maybe it was written at a different time, possibly later, actually. So many scholars I believe that he wrote book 1 last, and then it was added as a preface. Even now, some of us will write the preface or write the introduction last and stick it at the front of the book. And it looks like that's what he did. In which case, the main part of the book begins at passage 2.1, which is the one you've just quoted and the most famous passage in the book. And that's the opening passage of the whole book. Now, the earliest manuscript we have of that book had a title. And it's not the Meditations. It was called, in Greek, it's called To Himself. And that's partly because that's a recurring phrase. He says, to myself. Like, say to yourself, he says. He uses that phrase repeatedly throughout the whole book. And so that was originally the title that was stuck on it. Whether he chose us or an editor, we don't know. But passage 2.1, he says, say to yourself. And that's the title of the book. Things that you yourself,
because it wasn't written for other people.
You're going to meet meddlers, traitors, like liars. Now, I'll tell you something odd about the Meditations. When you read that book, and I've read it many, many, many times over decades, I've studied it very closely, and I've read many different translations. I've pulled it apart. I've written about it extensively. I run courses on it. And I still find little, almost like sort of biblical levels of analysis, but I still find little bits in it. But one of the broad observations sometimes people make is when you read that book, it's one of our few examples of the private thoughts of a Roman emperor. So we know about the histories of the Roman emperors, but we don't get many insights into the private life. And with Marcus, we actually have 2 insights. We have this personal journal that he wrote. And in the 1850s, an Italian scholar called Angelo May discovered a cache of private letters that Marcus Aurelius had written to his rhetoric tutor, Marcus Cornelius Fronto. And those were never meant for publication.
Wow.
And so we have a real window into his actual personal life. And first of all, it shocks people, because some people who read the Meditations quite superficially, I have to say, think, oh, he sounds a bit depressed. He sounds quite serious, this guy. And what they don't realize is that Stoicism, this isn't his personality. He's deliberately employing these Stoic practices. That's not Marcus. He's going through it. He's a kind of workbook that he's going through that tells him to meditate on death and so on. But when you then look at his private letters, he's good-humored. He's a really nice guy. He's incredibly affectionate towards his friends, family, and also you can see evidence in his letters that he's without question a very skilled diplomat. I find this incredibly appealing because all the way back to Socrates says many strange things. But one of the strange things that Socrates says is that he thinks part of the art of being a philosopher is about reconciling arguments between your friends, and that knowing how to matchmake friends and how to develop friendship is integral to being a philosopher. That seems very strange today. That's not something that we would at all associate. And Socrates even calls himself a pimp. Like he says he's a kind of pimp for virtue. Like he's kind of selling friendship and kind of matching up wise people with potential students. But he joked, like, Socrates is this crazy guy. I'm a kind of pimp for wisdom. And but there in Marcus Aurelius, like 500 years later, in his personal life, this isn't him claiming this. We can see him doing it. He's incredibly subtle and skilled at managing arguments between his friends. And he's a smart cookie. And also on the world stage, he, as Roman emperor, a big part of his job was to act as a diplomat. Marcus Aurelius was all about peacekeeping and negotiating treaties and stuff. So you imagine this guy spent his life doing this, and you can see him even doing it among his friends. But he's also an incredibly warm and affectionate guy, and so you don't really see that side of him in the Meditations. But it blows out of the water this kind of misconception that Stoics are like Mr. Spock. The guy in those letters couldn't be less like Mr. Spock or a robot or kind of stone-faced or whatever, and Socrates wasn't like that either. Socrates was an incredibly humorous, very affectionate, incredibly charismatic, likable guy. He wasn't like an android. So the other thing that seems odd about the Meditations, what was I going to say about them? Okay, it's gone. It'll come back to me in a minute. But the style that they are written in is, seems kind of gloomier in a way than it actually is. So Marcus Aurelius is forcing himself to meditate on death. I know what I was going to say. When you read the Meditations, there's very surprisingly little hint in there. So it's a valuable insight into the personal thoughts of this powerful man. That's unusual. You don't have that for Augustus, for example, or other Nero, other famous Roman emperors. We'd love to know more about what was going on in their head, especially given how different it seems to be from what the historians tell us about the external story of their reign. And what's going on in Marcus's head has surprisingly little to do with world affairs. Like when you read the Meditations, you get the feeling that he's mainly talking about his friends and his family and kind of like sort of petty everyday disagreements with people and stuff that he's dealing with. The passage you're talking about, it sounds like, I'll qualify that, but it comes across like he's saying every morning, tell yourself you're going to have to deal with meddling people, interfering people, liars, traitors, like dishonesty, right? And because the way he phrases it, it sounds like small scale stuff, right? But when you know more about his life, you realize he must at some level be talking about these seismic world events that he's facing. Probably after he'd written that, he faced a civil war where he was betrayed by one of his most senior generals and apparently a close friend, a guy called Avidius Cassius. So the guy that wrote every day, prepare yourself to deal with traitors, at some level, although he's maybe talking about court intrigue and kind of sort of trivial things, and he definitely had that in mind, he must also be talking about events that threatened the future of European civilization. World historic seismic events. But when you're reading the Meditations, you lose sight of that. It feels like it could be anybody. Like it doesn't even necessarily. You kind of forget he's a Roman emperor, like the most powerful man in the known world. It's hard. You would never imagine. It seems so small scale and so personal. Marcus Aurelius before writing it, he says he wrote part of it at Carnuntum. He writes at Carnuntum.
Okay.
Now, I went to Carnuntum recently in Austria on the banks of the Danube. There was a Roman legionary fortress there. So Marcus had to go there and take command of the Roman legions that he'd massed in order to defend the empire against a huge invasion of a coalition of northern barbarian foreign tribes. And Marcus wanted his brother, his co-emperor Lucius Verus, to do it, but Lucius died of the plague. It was plague at the time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So Marcus was thrown into this situation without any military training whatsoever in his mid-40s, having probably never left Italy before. He donned the military cape and robes, as the Historia Augusta puts it. In other words, he put on his general's uniform, and he rode out across the Alps to this foreign country and took command of the largest army ever assembled on a Roman frontier, which we estimate would have numbered 140,000 men,
Wow.
including legions, auxiliary units, cavalry, the Roman navy that sailed in the Danube, 140,000 soldiers under his command. He'd never been in the army. Like the guy that he wanted to do this had just dropped dead. Like, and so he was in the middle of a plague, a smallpox epidemic, and he had no choice but to do this. And so imagine the pressure. And he was sickly. They say that he had to stand in the army camp and deliver speeches to the legionaries assembled before him, and he struggled to do it in the winter because he was so frail that he tended to lose his voice in the cold air. He coughed up blood, and we don't know what was wrong with him exactly, but he had chest and stomach pains. He's believed he had problems eating. He maybe had chronic stomach ulcers, among other things. But he was facing an incredible challenge when he wrote that book. There's hardly any indication of that. It's easy to forget that. He seems just like a regular guy in a way.
Yeah.
Like he's doing philosophy. You don't think as he's writing this, and then he's going to put his pen down and he's going to go out and deliver a speech to hundreds, thousands of legionaries in orders that are going to be disseminated to an army of 140,000 men. Like, it's almost inconceivable. But there's one passage where he says what Marcus tends to do unintentionally. He kind of conceals his circumstances in a way because of something that he does. He tends to take aspects of his real world situation and turn them into metaphors for philosophy.
Okay.
So he says, for example, there's certain things that are inevitable in life. Like if someone betrays you, it's bound to happen eventually, especially if you're a Roman emperor. You know, it's part of the deal. Like you get betrayed, so you need to be ready for it. And he says, like we were talking about earlier, he compares being frustrated with that or shocked by it to being frustrated by the neighing of horses if you happen to be stationed near where horses are stabled. Now, in Carnuntum, there would be hundreds of horses because of the Roman cavalry units that were stationed there.
Yep.
Like, so even in that little passage, Marcus is probably talking, he's not just, it sounds like he's just plucking a metaphor out of thin air, but he says he had problems sleeping, and he would have been surrounded by hundreds of horses. So it would have been kind of noisy. And he said, it's like the constant neighing of horses. Like, it's just one of those irritants in your environment, but you have to learn to live with it. You have to accept it. Like it's like asking the horses to shut up. You know, it would be a ridiculous thing to do. Rather, it's your responsibility to learn to get over it and live with it. But in one passage, he says that he's talking about philosophy as a whole. He gives us beautiful little fragment of oratory or rhetoric, where he says that in it, he says famously, philosophy, talking of philosophy, he says life is warfare and a sojourn in a foreign land. Now, as many scholars most people probably wouldn't even notice that when they're reading it, but as many scholars have pointed out, he's definitely sounds like he's describing his situation at that time. Like, he was in a foreign land. He was in Austria. He'd never been out of Italy before. He crossed the Alps. He wasn't used to the climate or the environment at all. He's surrounded by foreigners. And he was engaged in this colossal war. Like, but he's turning it here into a metaphor for life in general. And he does that at one point with the plague. He says, I'll tell you what's an even more serious epidemic, moral corruption. He says, in a sense, that's even more serious than the Antonine Plague. Like, and so he's in this seismic event which killed maybe at least perhaps 10% or more of the Roman population. It's one of the worst plagues in history. And you're reading the Meditations, you're oblivious to the fact that this is going on around him, and perhaps Marcus. Except there's this one passage where again he turns it into he twists it around and turns it into a kind of metaphor for life in general, or metaphor for philosophy. So there are more references to his environment than you first realize, because you think he's just using these like curious.
Yeah, you forget that. Yeah.
He talks about being in the amphitheater and seeing the wild beast fighters, and seeing also watching wrestlers and gladiators. He says like philosophy is more like being a boxer than a gladiator, because a gladiator can put down his sword and lose it, pick it back up again, but the boxer only has to clench his fist and he's armed himself. And Marcus had trained in boxing and also trained to fight in armor, possibly with gladiators, when he was a young man. So he had a lot of experience of these kind of Roman sports, as it were. And to him, this is a metaphor for philosophy. Again, we talked about memorizing these pithy sayings. He's saying that once you've memorized them, for Stoics, clenching your fist is like focusing your mind on a saying. He said that, but it's always there, ready to hand. They like to use this expression, it means ready to hand for their principles. Whereas someone who, I guess, who's read self-help books superficially would be like the gladiator. He goes, oh, I've got this sword, but it's not become part of him. Like, he could lose it, or I left it at home today. Like Marcus says, no, you need to be more like the boxer. It might be maybe that sometimes you relax your hands, but at any moment, if you wanted to, you can clench them, and that principle would be back there in your mind. Like the self-help lessons that you've learned, or you carry with you everywhere you go. Like, you've memorized these precepts and saying, and all you need to do is turn your attention and focus on them occasionally. You've always got your weapons, as it were, with you in order to face the warfare of life.
Yeah. Well, that's incredible. Thanks for sharing that. I think Marcus Aurelius, he's just such a humble man. Like if he had everything. He had he was also around like women as well. He had alcohol around him, but he didn't indulge in those in the entertainment. He didn't do any of that stuff. He just focused on himself. That was
the way that we're told the stories and the histories, and we do. By the way, I'll qualify this by saying we have to take the histories. We have several histories, three main ones of Marcus's reign, and some other fragments from Hedorian, Cassius Dio, and the Historia Augusta. And we have little bits of archaeological evidence and stuff as well. And we have to take it with a pinch of salt, because these stories are biased, and often it looks like they have an agenda. But the way that we're told the story of Marcus's reign, his adoptive brother and co-emperor, Lucius Verus, is like the opposite. And he was, compared to Nero in that, he was a playboy. All he did was get drunk and play dice all night, and he surrounded himself with courtesans, and just put on extravagant banquets, and was always at the race course, and was obsessed with gambling, and never did much work, and he to let his generals do all the fighting during the Parthian War, while he was just off like holidaying and stuff all the time, although he was meant to be in command. And so he did the opposite. He saw being an emperor as like an opportunity. I don't know what's the expression, like an invitation to a party. And I have to say, there are kind of several ways that a Roman emperor could hang on to power. So a Roman emperor technically is acclaimed by the military. He's first and foremost really supreme commander. Like that's what imperator means. Like he's theoretically he's the head of the military. But so the one way a Roman emperor can hang on to power is to get really in with the military, and to do that you have to have a good war, like basically, or you have to give the military a lot of money, which is kind of like a slightly risky thing to do as well. But you have to kind of be popular with the military, and that will shore up your base and make you powerful. Another way you can hang on to power is to be popular with the Senate. To do that, you have to agree with everything they say.
Yep.
or at least kind of go along with them a lot. You have to be willing to share power with them. And the emperor essentially had a veto on everything the Senate could do. But some emperors said, look, I'm going to rule collaboratively with the Senate. I see myself as sharing power. And that's what Marcus did. He said every major decision or appointment he took, he ran it past the Senate first. And he said, I see myself as sharing power jointly with you guys. It's not a dictatorship. Although a Roman emperor could, if he wanted, run it like a dictatorship, and he could just purge the Senate. But Marcus tried not to do that. And the other way an emperor could hang on to power is by getting the population of Rome on his side. And the way to do that is by becoming what we call today a celebrity. Okay. And the way to do that is by posing a lot, making sure you look nice, having lots of famous friends, throwing lots of extravagant parties, putting on big festivals. And so Nero tried to do that. Lucius Verus tried to do that. Commodus tried to do that. Marcus thought that was toxic. He thought that this is not a good way to hang on to power. But his co-emperor Lucius Verus kind of looks like he's going down that route. He doesn't really care about much about the military. He just abandons them and leaves them to it. He doesn't seem really that interested in doing politics with the Senate. But he was a celebrity. They say he had blonde. A lot of people imagine by the way, we don't know what color Marcus Aurelius' hair was.
Oh, wow. I was assuming it was blonde, right?
He's depicted having dark brown hair. But Commodus, his son, had blonde hair. So it's and I think he'd look weird if we imagine him with, but because we're so used to it, but he may have had blonde hair. But Lucius Verus had blonde hair, and we're told that it was believed, or at least rumored, that he sprinkled gold dust on his hair.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Without a shadow of doubt, if Lucius Verus was alive today, he would definitely be on Instagram.
Yeah,
he'd be huge on Instagram. And that's exactly what he was all about. And Marcus was like, nah. Marcus was a workaholic. He spent his entire life in the law courts, studying jurisprudence, preparing to rule as a bureaucrat, negotiating with the Senate. And then when he had to, he assumed command of the military. And that's a nice story in a way as well, because at the beginning, it's implied, and we can certainly assume, that the army must have thought, who is this guy? The army were very kind of, as you might imagine,
who's this person?
Yeah. Who is this guy? Some bureaucrat, from back in Rome, who's never even set foot outside. He's barely been out of the city. He hasn't traveled that much to the north of Italy, let alone across the Alps. Who's he to take command? He doesn't have any military training at all, which is unusual for a Roman noble. He spent all of his time in Rome running the city and involved in law. So they thought, who is this joker? But towards the end of the war, maybe 6 or 7 years later, they idolize him. He's acclaimed the imperator over and over again. The legions are even attributing battlefield miracles to him. They clearly idolize him. So he won them over. As one thing we can say, it certainly looks like he went into this situation as an underdog, as it were. It's a very dangerous situation for him. To put himself at the front line, several Roman officers had already died. The enemy massively outnumbered the Romans and could swarm them if they chose to. It was risky business. And so he won a lot of respect by doing it. And by the end, one of the reasons that Marcus got out through the Civil War unscathed, he won the Civil War against him, was that the legions were 100% loyal to him by that point. To almost shockingly to other people, they were like, he's our guy. They'd gone from thinking this guy's never seen any military service, he's just some sickly old bureaucrat, philosopher, whatever that is, to thinking 100% he's the guy, he's the best emperor that's ever been. We're all behind him. And that's the kind of story of his reign. I don't think maybe that's played up enough that he won this acclaim. But by the time Marcus Aurelius died, he was a legend. And to subsequent emperors, Like he's often held up as this kind of role model of the ideal emperor. But for Marcus, his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, is in the Meditations. He's very preoccupied with this idea of modeling excellence. And he, in the book 1 of the Meditations, he talks about, I think it's about 16 different people. And he lists their virtues, and they're all family members or tutors. And the one he says by far the most about is Antoninus Pius, his adoptive father and his predecessor as emperor. And that's partly because Marcus is looking at this guy thinking, I need to learn from my predecessor, but it's partly because he genuinely admires him and wants to be like him. But there's also, if you want to read the Meditations at a deeper level, sometimes it's interesting to look at what he doesn't say. So he lists all these people he admires. He mentions Lucius Verus in one sentence.
Okay.
Like, he's co-emperor. He said he's very loyal and affectionate.
Okay.
Now, you could say that about a puppy dog.
Yeah.
Like, he's kind of, I would describe that as damning him with faint praise. That's his co-emperor. And he does say something nice about him, but he's put so much thought into this. And the only thing he can come up with is the guy's affectionate and loyal.
And that's it.
Like, he probably was. But he didn't say he's also an idiot and a whoremonger and a gambler and an idler and like he's probably an alcoholic. Like, you know, he's a complete shambles according to the Historia Augusta in particular paints him as a car
he
crash.
held back, yeah.
But Marcus is trying to find like positive aspects to him, and but Antoninus Pius, he has this whole spiel about. And what's interesting about that, I guess, when you read these things and study them closely, is that you can say by looking at that, I think it's very I think we can be 99.9% certain that that's not the first time he's written that. Apart from anything else, later on in the same book, he also, in another passage, lists a bunch of virtues that belong to Antoninus Pius that are slightly different. So I would say this is an exercise that he's done repeatedly, and Pius has been dead for like over a decade by the time that Marcus is probably writing this. And he's still able to list in considerable detail. I mean, try doing that for someone that you admire. Like, he's got like a whole list of specific things. He's obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this. And and to be fair, that may be because in the Senate, he would have been expected to give speeches praising. For example, at his funeral, he would have delivered a eulogy, right? And also at other points, maybe on the anniversary of his death, he would have given several speeches praising his adoptive father. But also as a personal exercise, he seems to be contemplating this, and he's developed it in more depth, in surprising depth. But the other thing that he doesn't say is he doesn't mention Hadrian. And Hadrian was his adoptive grandfather.
Okay.
And Hadrian that chose Marcus to be emperor. So he said, I'm appointing this guy Antoninus Pius as my successor, but after him, I want him to adopt Marcus, and then after him. So Hadrian was a control freak.
Okay.
Right. He planned his succession several steps in advance. And so Marcus is like 2 steps removed or whatever from Hadrian. He said, like, it's going to be Antoninus, and then after him, long after I'm dead, it'll be Marcus Aurelius that becomes emperor. And that's the deal. And everyone was cool with that because they were like, yeah, this kid Marcus, he's got the potential. But Marcus says nothing about him. He's got nothing good to say about him. And he mentions him several times in the Meditations, but only really as an example of some guy that died a long time ago, to remind himself of his own mortality. But he doesn't have anything to say about his good qualities. And actually, if you're really interested in Roman history, if you read what he says about Antoninus Pius, half the things he says about him can be read as implicit criticisms of Hadrian.
Wow.
So he'll say, no one could ever call Antoninus Pius a sophist. So like a kind of pretentious, bogus intellectual. No one would ever accuse him of being that. Well, it's almost like in brackets after that, he's got, unlike Hadrian, like everybody called a sophist. And he said Antoninus Pius had a lot of patience. He was willing to listen to anybody that had questions for him, unlike Hadrian. Bothered with people like, and so if you're interested in Roman history, the subtext there is he thought Hadrian was a terrible emperor. and an appalling role model. But luckily for Marcus, the emperor that intervened, Antoninus Pius, was quite a different character. I'm finding a lot of these things become more vivid for me now, because at the moment I'm working on a graphic novel about
wow.
So trying to kind of visualize these things that before were just in black and white and words, suddenly makes the connections, the context seem more obvious, and how the whole story perhaps was intended to be read. But
so,
yeah,
so that's right after. That's right after your next project, the graphic novel.
That's my next book. We're in the middle of doing it at the moment, but it takes a long time to get the artwork done. So it might be like a year and a half, probably about a year and a half from now, before it actually hits the shelves. But I'm hoping that the main thing I'm hoping that achieves is just to reach different people. I'm kind of picking up that vibe at the moment, that there are people that tell me they don't really read that many books, but they read graphic novels, and maybe a younger demographic. And I think it'd be awesome to take Stoic philosophy and put it in front of people that maybe don't read all that many history books, but maybe would read a graphic novel. So they might not have that much access to some of this stuff normally. And I like the idea of just showing them, just going, just check this out, read this book. And it's a pretty cool story, but at the end of it, you may also have ideas that would actually help you to deal with anger, and maybe ideas or concepts or ways of thinking that might actually help you deal with misfortunes and losses in life.
I think, I mean, as you know, we live in a technology-driven world. There's lots of distractions, and it's hard to focus. So I think that graphic novel would be, vital for people to understand more about Stoicism. Even some sort of animation video, that can just walk people through how powerful and how humble Marcus Aurelius was. So I think that's amazing. It's a great idea. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So if there was one thing that you could take away from Stoicism, what would it be?
One takeaway thing. Well, I'll give you two things, because I've mentioned one of them already, and I'll give you another thing. So one of them would be that passage from Epictetus that says it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them. I think that's one of the fundamental truths of Stoicism. And I know that many people tell me that's their takeaway from Stoicism. And it should be, because the research now validates like that way of thinking. And there are many techniques that follow on from that. I haven't got time to explain those, but people can read about them. But something we haven't mentioned that's a takeaway would be what we call the view from above.
Yeah.
So Marcus Aurelius in particular says, imagine yourself high overhead looking down at events, the weddings, the separations, the births, the deaths, the traders in the marketplace, the armies assembled for war, political assemblies, tongues clacking in law courts. He says, imagine all of this stuff spread out as if you're looking from high overhead. And one of the other sources, where is it now? In Ovid, he describes a similar thing. He says, imagine you're standing on the shoulders of Atlas, though. Seems like an obvious metaphor, looking down from high above. And you could also say, imagine like Zeus looking down from Mount Olympus. And with people today say a helicopter view. The French scholar Pierre Hadot, who I mentioned earlier, coined the term the view from above to describe this technique, which Marcus actually attributes to Plato. And Plato would have put it in the mouth of Socrates, although it's not really clear which passage he's talking about in Plato. But the other thing I'd say about the view from above is that in many ancient towns and cities, they often grow up around certain natural features, like beside a river or a harbour. But a lot of ancient towns grew up around hills where there were citadels or forts built that could be defended from attack. In Athens is like that. There are several hills around Athens, but the main one in the centre is where the Acropolis is located. And this is a very sacred place. It's the temple of Athena, who's the patron goddess of wisdom and of Athens. So Socrates and other Athenian philosophers would have been very familiar with walking up the Acropolis, to the sacred place, and looking down at the rest of Athens and seeing exactly the things. Marcus Aurelius actually uses the word agora. He says, looking down at agoras, marketplaces. And that's exactly what you, from the Acropolis, you have a view of the agora, where the merchants sold their wares, where philosophers argued, where people drew water from wells, and where political assemblies took place. But it would seem like the people are spread out like ants beneath you, so you have this kind of detached perspective on things. And the Stoics think that doing this is a good way of building resilience and coping with stress. And I'll just add to that, it's really part of everything in Stoicism. It's not just a gimmick or a technique. It has a deeper meaning that fits within a whole worldview and system of philosophy. So what that really, so there's a reason for doing it. It's not just that it works, like it's beneficial, but there's actually a logic behind it. So the Stoics argue that reality consists in the whole of space and time considered in its entirety. So they say, well, surely the truth must be the whole context. Anytime we look at anything in isolation, we're kind of taking it out of context, and we're committing a kind of lie of omission. And the only way to get around that would be to think of the truth with a capital T as being, if you could somehow grasp the whole history of the universe in one go and see things situated within that entire context. And they say, well, that would be impossible unless you were Zeus, unless you were God, and you could comprehend. So this would be a godlike perspective. But they think the closer you can get to that, the better. And when someone says something to you, like liars, traitors, meddling fools, and so on, that you're going to encounter each day, we naturally tend to narrow our scope of attention down and focus on it in isolation. So it's like we put it under a magnifying glass and get even more upset by it. But the philosophers realized that in a way that's a lie of omission. We only get that upset when we take it out of context. But if we broaden our context to think of that person's life as a whole, and this is one thing that they've done, and maybe there were a whole series of things from their childhood that led up to that, and maybe think of that as one encounter that we have in the whole of our lives. It's just one person among thousands and thousands that we've met. And we think of that event and the whole history of the human life, then inevitably it seems kind of more trivial. It seems less surprising. It seems it's balanced out by all of the other competing stimuli that we now have going on in our minds. And so the Stoics would say, well, like, the only way that you can get that angry about it is in a way by lying to yourself and taking it out of context and committing a lie of omission and distorting it by putting it under a magnifying glass. But although we're mortal and we can't comprehend the whole of space and time, if we could, these things would seem trivial to us. And as philosophers, we can at least try to broaden our perspective a bit. And that's what they do Marcus talks about this repeatedly towards the end of the Meditations in particular. He keeps coming back to this idea of picturing events from high above.
Wow, that's amazing. That's like, there's so much wisdom when you're zooming out from a helicopter and you can just see things. That just reminds me of like for the past year I've been meditating. So every day 10 minutes I just spend a bit of time meditating, and from that point I've just realized that I just realized that thoughts is really just like electrical impulses in the brain, and when you just look down as just a thought, it's just a thought, then you don't really get so wrapped up in the emotions of thought. It's just, something just passes by. So you don't really need to entertain that. So it's just a monkey that just dances around in the mind, right? So you don't need to capture it, chase it, you just leave it. And it's so much wisdom in just observing things.
Well, the Stoics had the same idea about thoughts just being, in one passage Epictetus says that we should talk to our thoughts and say, you're just an impression, just a thought, and not at all the thing that you represent. Right? You're just something passing through my mind. And he tells his students to literally say that. So Marcus's book was called To Himself, things that he says, say to yourself. Epictetus says, say to yourself, you're just an impression. Or say to the impression, like, you're just an impression and not at all the thing you claim to represent. Or in Greek, it sounds better. It's difficult to translate. into English, but it's like you're just an appearance and not at all the thing appearing or that claims to be appearing in Greek.
Wow.
Some things are trickier to translate than others, but in Greek
Yeah.
it's a little bit more fluid, and it's more concise. But you get the idea. It's like this saying, the map is not the territory. Epictetus is saying, remind yourself it's just a thought. Like, it's just a representation of things, and don't confuse it with reality.
It's not, yeah.
And put it in its place. Say, like, you're just noise that's going through my mind, right?
Yeah.
Like voices in the radio or something like that. So you're just something that happens to pop into my mind. And he says, when desires and strong feelings pop into your mind, if you can, he says, take a step back from them and pause, and then wait until you've calmed down before you decide how to respond. And we call this a postponement strategy today. It's a similar strategy.
Wow.
It requires the ability to step back from your thoughts and say, like, you're just a thought. I don't have to act on this desire. Like, I could leave it a few hours. I could sleep on it. I could come back and think, do I still think it's a good idea to act on these feelings of anger or on this desire? We call that the postponement strategy, or you could call it taking a time out. Especially in anger management, it's a popular technique. But the other ancient schools, the Platonists and the Pythagoreans, seem to have had this idea as well. It was a commonplace in ancient philosophy. But Epictetus several times tells his students to do this, to develop the knack of spotting these thoughts, and rather than kind of hanging on to them, being dragged along by them, like to have a kind of hands-off approach to their own thoughts, feelings, and desires, and just notice them, and then go, I'm not going to even react to this right now. I'm going to leave it, like, and maybe I'll come back to it later. I'll see if I still feel the same way about it later.
Fantastic. All right. So how can people get in contact with you and find out what the events that you're speaking at, and the books that you're planning on writing?
Well, my website is just my name. It's Donald Robertson, all one word, .name. So it's not .com, it's .name.
Yep.
And there, it's got all my social media stuff and my e-learning site and my Twitter and everything. So I'm pretty active online. I have a lot of online courses. Most of them are free that people can do. And I've got some big courses that I run on Socrates and on Marcus Aurelius. And you'll find out about books and stuff there. It's hard. I find myself doing so many different things.
Yeah.
To keep everybody updated on them. So the other thing at the moment is my book's being translated into I think about 9 different languages, and so far I like to run through the list. We've got the English translation. Also, the audio book is massively outselling the other formats, which has surprised the publisher. So the audio book of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor is particularly popular with people. Particularly, I recorded it myself because the last chapter of it I wrote in the first person. So I wanted, when people listen to the final chapter, that it would seem almost like a guided meditation. And so I was quite gratified when people started reviewing it, and they said, yeah, that's what it felt like. And they seem to really enjoy that part, and especially in the audiobook version. But in terms of languages, I'm in Greece partly because it's been translated into Greek. It's translated into Dutch. I was in Holland for that. It's been translated already into German and into Italian, and it's about to be translated into Brazilian Portuguese. And there's other
amazing
languages, like in Spanish, and translated into Korean,
and
other things as well. So you can find updates about these things on Twitter, and I have a big Facebook group that's got just under 60,000 people in it for discussing Stoicism as well. So I tend to post a lot of stuff there too. Great.
Fantastic. Well, Donald, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for the wisdom. This podcast interviews is incredibly insightful, and I know so many people are going to get a lot of wisdom from it. And that being said, wish you all the best for your future endeavors. And I know that you're going to be spreading wisdom throughout the entire world, and you're going to be impacting the world in very positive ways. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your questions.
No worries. Great.